Well, on the recruiting front, just about all eyes for Dan Lanning are on 2024. And so far, off to a good start. Here we go.
You are Locked On Ducks, your daily podcast on the Oregon Ducks, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Yes, it is that time once again for Locked On Ducks. I'm your host, Spencer McLaughlin. Thank you so much for making this your first listen or your first view of the day. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your number one source to stay up to date with the Ducks. If you haven't already, like, comment, subscribe, please, and thank you wherever you listen to or watch this show. You may notice I am donning a distinct red jacket today. That is because as we record this episode, it is just before I leave for the flight with the Southern Utah women's basketball team. They're dancing for the first time in program history. I get to call the game on radio on Friday. Stoked for that. So I got to rep the T-Birds here and give them their due credit. And we're always happy to have John Garcia Jr. to join me here on the show as well, our Locked On recruiting insider. John, it may be basketball season, but football is more on the mind of Duck fans right now, given that both teams unfortunately missed the tournament. Couldn't be Southern Utah, though. Dancing, baby, but good to have you on the show.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's a fun time of year. And look, a lot of these kids are going to make visits and watch a little March Madness along the way. So it should be cool.
It should indeed. So recruiting now is almost entirely. We will still get to that one outstanding name in the 2023 cycle, but the recruiting focus for Dan Lanning and his staff, as crazy it is as it is, and it really is wild to me, is on 2024. And it's very early in the process. There are just 5 commits, and that's, I feel like, pretty standard for this point in time. Last year at this time, I think Oregon had 3 or 4. But so far, John, off to an incredibly strong start with 5 4-star recruits having already committed to the Ducks. What do you make of that right now for Dan Lanning and his staff?
Yeah, it's a strong group, like you said. 4 of the 5 are right there in that Pac-12 footprint, and you've hit some priority position guys in that process with Fox Crater, the offensive tackle from Washington, which is always good for Ducks to go into that state, I'm sure, from a rivalry perspective. And then Jackson Jones, the pass rusher out of Arizona, another, sort of enemy territory footprint to try to dig into more and more as those metro areas improve. And then your highest rated commit maybe is Tyseer Denmark, the receiver from all the way across the country in Pennsylvania. So another sort of example of the Duck brand sitting as a true national one from all angles, but certainly as pass catchers, you always feel like Oregon's going to be in the mix for many of the nation's best, and they've already got 3 pass catchers in this class. So premium position guys and pass catchers being built in early. Pretty good start, as you mentioned. Naturally, the elephant in the room is the quarterback position, but those targets are developing for the Ducks. They just offered Air Nolan, who's maybe one of the top 2 or 3 uncommitted QBs in the class, a 4-star out of Georgia coming off a state title season. I think he threw for like 4,500 yards last year, and he's a dual threat. So a lot to like about Air Nolan's game. He's taken a bunch of visits and taking the process a little bit slow. So if you can get out to Eugene, you like where you stand there. And then there's other, more long-standing targets, right? Whether it's, Isaac Wilson, the BYU legacy, younger brother of Zach, Luke Moga from Arizona. There's a pretty strong QB board that's developing for the Ducks. And they're going to be in the mix, as usual, for some of the nation's best. So that's the next step in this class. But, yeah, the foundation is good, and all the big visits are still ahead of it. So you're in strong position if you're a Duck fan.
It's interesting that the last couple of years, we've seen Oregon, from an offensive skill position standpoint, recruit backwards, right? Usually it's quarterback and then skill positions follow. But right now, just like in the 2023 cycle, I mean, they had Jurion Dickey, they had Kyler Casper, they had all these guys before they landed a top quarterback commit. And I look at the 2 wide receivers that are at the top of the 2024 cycle right now for the Ducks, which, sits at 7th in the country, but there's a long way to go on that particular front. But, let's say you keep at least one of these guys, Tyseer Denmark or Jordan Anderson, who, have a composite rating just over 95 on 24/7 4-star recruits. I think as you look to the future, it makes a lot of sense that they would be going after this position, because I don't remember how many years of eligibility Trayshawn Holden has, but he's spent at least 2 at Alabama, I believe. And Troy Franklin is probably gone to the NFL after this year. And you have some other promising names in the mix, to be sure, right? The Kyler Caspers, Jurion Dickeys of the world. But that's a position where it seems like pretty soon Oregon is going to need to, have some high-level recruits coming in, because Troy Franklin has been so good, and I expect him to have an even better year this season as well.
Yeah, so you've got to recruit towards balancing out your roster, and yeah, if you see multiple takes at one position that's not O-line or D-line this early in the game, it's usually an indicator that it's going to be a bigger class, at least in principle and in desire from the program's perspective. So yeah, it wouldn't shock to see three or four, maybe even more wide receivers brought into this Oregon class because of that developing situation. And look, after spring ball, it might be even more clear from the Oregon perspective, and you're also potentially up for attrition after spring ball. So all of this is fluctuating and fluid in nature, but usually if you're zeroing in on commitments this early at positions like that, it's going to be a bigger haul from a volume perspective.
And I think positionally for Oregon in the 2024 cycle, I think linebacker is going to be addressed more from the high school ranks than it was in the 2023 class, where they took, I'm pretty sure, just one actual linebacker in Jerry Mixon. They've got a number of edge players in there, Blake Purchase, Tatum Tuioti, those sorts of guys. But like traditional linebackers, they do have some who are grandfathered in from past classes who are promising recruits that haven't played a lot or at all in their Oregon careers, like Harrison Taggart and Devin Jackson. But I think wide receiver is a position, tight end is a position. They've got one of those as well. North Medford kid, always like seeing the Ducks get those 4 stars that are coming out of state. Last 4-star pass catcher to come out of Medford, I believe, was Chase Cota, and he worked out pretty well, I would say. But the other one that I don't think Oregon's going to have a big emphasis on for 2024 is defensive back. Not to say they won't go get some, but they added a lot. Defensive back and defensive line. I mean, they almost overloaded with that in the 2023 class. So I expect at least that they won't have that same sort of volume, barring a barrage of transfers after the season.
Yeah, and it helps you play with that narrow focus, right? You can prioritize guys a little bit earlier in the process, and that's how you get, in early on a Williams Nwaneri out of Kansas City, who's very high on the Ducks, and David Stone, some of these other defensive linemen that are, above 4 stars that are going to be centerpiece type players wherever they end up at the next level. So yeah, that helps you do that if you feel comfortable taking a smaller number. So it's the opposite of what we said for some of these skill position groups that are already, larger than smaller.
Yeah, and up front, you're always going to add a lot of bodies. It's kind of the nature of the beast. You got to add a lot of guys there because some will develop quicker than others. Some are more ready-made. A guy like Brandon Dorless, for instance, on the defensive line was a developmental piece. He's turned into what will one day be, I think, a pretty solid NFL player. But he was a middling 3-star recruit at the time. But he's developed in that sense, and his body is developed as well. And that applies to the offensive line, where you have some guys that take a little bit longer. But then you have your Josh Connerlys, who can step in and play right away. Probably will be Oregon's left tackle this year. But what about the geography? What about where Oregon needs to go? We'll talk about that after we talk about FanDuel. It's past the midway point of the NBA season. March Madness is literally here, happening as you listen to or watch this show, most likely. So you need to go get America's #1 sportsbook. New customers get a no-sweat first bet up to $1,000. That's bonus bets back if your first bet doesn't win. Plus, FanDuel even lets you combine your bets for a chance at a bigger payout with a same-game parlay. So don't miss the chance to get your no-sweat first bet up to $1,000 back in bonus bets when you go to FanDuel.com/lockedon. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon to learn more. Make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sports betting partner of the NBA. You can also download the app, which is safe, secure, and super easy to use. All right, so geographically, it's always a fascinating discussion on the recruiting front because you've got a lot of great players. I think Oregon as a program needs to be heavily or have a pretty good presence in 2 of the 3 big states: California, Texas, Florida. I don't think you need to be in all 3 consistently. We saw more Florida kids with the Mario Cristobal staff, but now Dan Lanning and company, I think, are kind of shifting that to Texas in addition to California. And California's always got to be there, right? Like that's just a necessity, and I think Oregon is going to be able to continue to do that going forward. But are there any other areas that you think Oregon needs to prioritize, and how do you see that balance of focusing on SoCal versus focusing on Texas for the staff?
Well, those I think are the two primary states. I think there's really from a volume perspective and a talent perspective, it's got to be those two. So the question becomes to me, Spencer, does Florida kind of permanently hold that number 3 spot, or could another state creep up on it? And interestingly enough, we've talked about better talent in the state of Arizona over the last few years in particular, of course, in that Pac-12 footprint as well. I think that's the state where you're going to see more Duck efforting, not only because, look, Kenny Dillingham is now down there and you expect Arizona State to recruit at a bit of a higher clip, but the talent level there is seemingly rising at a steady pace each and every recruiting cycle. We've already mentioned multiple Arizona recruits 11 minutes into this podcast, right? So
Yeah.
naturally, I think Arizona is going to be the next state where we start talking about it, almost like we do with Florida from the Oregon perspective, where it's like you've got to hit it consistently. I think California and Texas are a given, especially following the most recent staff changes at Oregon. That's going to be consistent for the Ducks. So it's about those next tier states, and I think Arizona is the one that's trending up. Florida will always be there, of course. Oregon and Washington and the rest of the Pac-12 footprint are always going to have a presence, but I think Arizona is the one to keep an eye on.
Yeah, and Oregon's already got a commit from the state of Arizona, and I'd be surprised if you could find a class dating back to ever, honestly, when they didn't have at least one or two players, if not more, from the state of Arizona. Jackson Jones, 4-star edge out of Yuma Catholic down in Arizona, is the 2024 commit that they have right now. On the 2024 front, before I get to a listener question that I want to pose to you, what's the confidence level at this point in time that these guys will end up choosing the Ducks? Because there's a lot of time between now and the end of December, right? I mean,
Sure.
they've been committed for a few weeks. I think, they all have different dates when they've verbally committed, but we know that this sort of stuff can change. I'm sure there are people listening or watching right now thinking, well, we don't even know if those guys are going to be committed. But I remember one of Oregon's first commits in the 2023 cycle was Cole Martin, and Cole Martin ended up staying with the Ducks. So at this point in time, of those 5 players, how many do you expect the Ducks to actually land come December?
Yeah, until they really start to take a bunch of visits elsewhere and truly keep the door open on their end, you always feel like the Ducks are going to be able to hold on to the majority of the recruits that they want to, especially this time of year, right? It's incredibly early for folks or recruits to feel convicted enough to make a decision this early in the process does typically show some staying power. If you commit as a sophomore or as your first offer, you jump in on and commit, that's a bit of a different situation. But I think if you jump in sort of the window of where most recruits rise, end of junior year into senior year, you typically have a little bit more staying power. And that's where the majority of these 5 kids jumped on board for the Ducks. So naturally, you give them an Oregon, frankly, the benefit of the doubt to hold on to the majority of them. But of course, there's so many circumstances that can and will change all of this, right? We mentioned the transfer portal window opening in the month of May, the entirety of the offseason and summer official visits. Spring visits are still going down. And then these kids have a whole another year of high school ball to play. Their status, those evaluations, all of that will be tweaked before we get to that December signing period. So a lot of it can and will change. But as things stand right now, you feel pretty good about holding on to the majority.
Recruiting never stops, literally ever at all points in time. I wonder if coaches can even put their phones on Do Not Disturb when they go to sleep at night.
They should try.
Yeah,
They should try. I should say.
they should try. I wanted to pose this question. It came in a while back from a listener, which I always appreciate. And just a reminder, Duck fans, YouTube comments, Twitter at Smalls_55 or at Locked On Ducks, DMs and mentions wide open if you want a question answered on the show. Never, not once, has a question that has been sent to me by one of you gone unanswered here on the show. And I will never change that. So, Robert Henshaw says, what is your prediction for how many modern day football players pick Oregon in the 2024 class? Now, I read that question and thought that's oddly specific, but modern day is one of the most prestigious high
Of course,
schools
if
for
not the most.
athletics. Yeah, probably the most in the country. They generate, I mean, they're the sort of place that has, several blue chip players on it. And then you look at the roster back in time and you go, well, wait a second. Their 12th best player was a 3-star recruit who was a 3-year Power 5 start. Like
Yeah.
that's very much a thing. So how much of a priority is going to specific schools, or is it more just kind of the Southern California region?
Well, yeah, I was going to say, we talked about California always being that A1 pipeline state for the Ducks, and that will remain the case sort of forever. If you went to another layer or two on that, it would then go to the Los Angeles and SoCal area, and it would probably start there at Mater Dei or St. John Bosco. There's already 3 or 4 Monarchs, former Monarchs, on the current Oregon roster, and you always expect Oregon to be in the running for these types of recruits because, as you said, it's a prestigious program in one of the most fertile areas in the country, and they don't discriminate at Mater Dei. They churn out recruits at every single position, typically very good in the trenches, but we've seen that thing balloon out. They've got a quarterback, Elijah Brown, who's a blue chip, who's uncommitted, multiple O and D linemen that are very high level and national recruits that are going to be it's going to be USC, Oregon, and then insert other schools, whether it's Ohio State or Georgia, Alabama, Texas A&M. They're going to be national battles with modern day recruits every single year. So there's a bevy of them every year. It creeps into the double digits in terms of how many are Power 5 worthy. So if you're Oregon, you just kind of want to keep that pipeline going as much as possible and grab at least one of those guys every single year. And if you look at the current roster, again, there's a handful of Ducks that came from the program. So that never hurts in trying to further the pipeline that could be building with any school, especially if it's a modern day. But there's no doubt that Oregon will be in the mix for most of them.
Yeah, I think it's a little early to try and answer the question of how many specifically. I believe from the 2023 class, the answer is 2. I know it's at least 1. Lipe Moala, the offensive line. I'll check on that here real quick. But from a specific school, you mentioned the number of high caliber programs from a recruiting standpoint that are going to go after players from that school, and you have to factor in position of need. I think it's an interesting question. I don't think it'll go above 3. The most likely answer is probably 1 or 2.
Yeah,
but it's all dependent upon need, upon fit. Who else is involved? NILs now is such a big factor in this space. It's definitely a school to watch for. But Mateo's from St. John Bosco, which is kind of the same sort of area. And as I go through the 2023 commits, I think it is just the one from modern day, and that's Lipe Moala, 3-star offensive lineman, who I think you mentioned in the past is probably a little underrated at that spot. Big guy, 6'6", 330. You compare that to the 2024 offensive line commit the Ducks have, who projects as a tackle, Fox Crater out of Evergreen High School in the Vancouver, Washington area, 6'6", 285. I mean, you're talking about 50 pounds less. I feel like Moala's more kind of an interior offensive line build, and Crater looks a little bit more like a tackle in that front. But I mean, 50 pounds on the offensive line, that's certainly not nothing. But my prediction, I'll go with 2. I'll go with 2. There was 1 this past cycle. I'll go with 2 for modern day, just for fun.
And look, a lot of those kids are typically taking the process a little slower, right? Because modern day guys have offers early and they hit the visit trail hard. So that's going to be something to track later in the cycle for sure. But yeah, you expect Oregon to always stay in the game for those kids. Yeah.
Last thing I want to ask you about on today's show. 2 quick things, frankly. Number 1, Deuce Robinson. Do we have any update there? It's the only 2023 recruiting name out there. Mm-hmm. I would be so down for Oregon to get him. I think he could play right away. He could make an impact right away. Has Oregon been able to get on that visit radar for the 2023 five-star tight end?
I haven't seen it confirmed. He's still saying the right things when Oregon pops up, but I think that baseball schedule is pretty tough to contend with this time of year. It's sort of showcase season, right? The MLB draft is in the month of June, and Deuce is a guy whose stock is, according to most, rising. So he's still going to be weighing that decision, but from his standpoint, he wants to lock it down pretty soon. You know, he's talking about the month of April. I think he wants to make a college commitment no matter what, and then allow the rest of the draft process to play out. So then in the summer, it'll be sort of another conversation point, regardless of which school he picks. Is it now college versus maybe going the pro baseball route? So this is obviously an incredibly layered recruitment. I do think USC has swung the buzz their way just a little bit more. I've even heard some package deal conversations between Deuce and Dylan Raiola, the number one quarterback available in this class of 24. Both Arizona guys. We talked about the state of Arizona. Both Arizona guys. Obviously Raiola's a top target for Lincoln Riley. So if that works out, I do think that could potentially influence Deuce. But Raiola's also looking at Georgia, which is the school that held a lot of buzz for Deuce separately. So that's, I think, still potentially a destination for him. Texas is in there and Oregon is in there somewhere thereafter. But for the Ducks, it's always been about, can you grab a spring visit? And I haven't heard anything tangible enough to say, yes, they're going to get sort of that puncher's chance last shot before a decision comes in. So unless Robinson pushes back his timetable a little bit, I do think the Ducks are probably on the outside looking in.
All right, last thing that's more of an abstract thought that popped into my head I wanted to ask you is, Oregon's recruiting profile has increased significantly over the last 5-6 years or so, with going back to Willie Taggart, frankly, and then Mario Cristobal, took it to heights that we hadn't seen it get to before. And one thing that changed was the number of five-star recruits Oregon was suddenly able to go after and able to ultimately land. Now, some of them have really worked out. Kayvon Thibodeau, that worked out pretty well.
Pretty good.
Noah Sewell, that worked out pretty darn well. But then there have been others. Dante Manning is still on the roster and is not a surefire starting corner going into year 3. I think it is year 3 or 4. I don't even remember at this point. He's been in and out. He's played, but he hasn't popped. Justin Flo had all the hype in the world, second highest rated commit Oregon's ever gotten. Didn't work out. I've talked about how I think that was primarily due to injuries, but sure. You look at the 5 stars that pop at other schools and the ones that haven't popped at Oregon. Is there a magic elixir that Oregon is missing on that front, or is there just an element of randomness to even the most highly sought after recruits? Because on the surface, there's no reason Dante Manning shouldn't be an elite shutdown corner because he's more athletically gifted than everybody else, but he just isn't at this point in time. What fails to click there?
Well, you mentioned he's a great example, right? All the physical tools, the height, weight, everything requisite to the highest degree that you want at that position. But the things we can't track in the evaluation process are, how do you assimilate? How are you from a maturity standpoint? The technical elements, the intricacies of the position. Are you more of a zone or man guy? How does that fit in with what Dan Lanning wants relative to the rest of the cornerback room? I mean, there's so many factors that you just have to kind of wait on. And I think it's perfect that you mentioned 4 former 5 stars. Half of them really panned out the right way, half of them not quite. And I think that's probably reflective of most 5-star groupings in the country. You look at any of the schools that are pulling multiple 5 stars a year, and you probably see about a 50-50 requisite difference between the two. These guys hit the ground running immediately. These guys, kind of head scratching. What's going on? They're in the portal, or something didn't work out at their first collegiate stop. I think that's about right from a numbers perspective. If there's 32 5 stars every year to mimic the first round of the NFL draft, about half of them are pretty instant impact guys as true freshmen. And I think we saw that across the country in 2022. But there's another half that have already hit the portal and or are really struggling to assimilate to the next level, because these guys are 5 stars based on height, weight, speed, high school production, domination, and trajectory, but you can't really project the mental. You can't project the non-physical traits that it really does take, especially in this day and age of social media, so many distractions, NIL, all this stuff, the mental fortitude it takes to truly buy in and hit the ground running at the next level. Because look, it's still a big jump. Even for the most dominant players, you're still jumping to the next level where you're not the biggest, fastest, strongest guy on the field every single play. So even from that standpoint, it's a lot mentally to grasp, much less everything else schematically and as things get more sophisticated in the collegiate game.
Normally, I would add my own thoughts to that matter, but that would just, that would be diluting what was a pretty perfect take on that particular question. John Garcia Jr. John Garcia Jr. is our recruiting insider here at the Locked On Network. John, appreciate it as always.
Thanks for having me. Safe travels, man. Enjoy it.
Thank you. I most definitely will. And Duck fans, I'll get you the link on Friday if you want to tune in and hear me talking play-by-play style on the radio as Southern Utah takes on Notre Dame in their first ever March Madness game. Appreciate everyone listening. See you next time. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and go Ducks.